In the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky, where pine trees press close like silent sentinels, and the wind carries voices no one wants to remember, there once stood a building so feared, locals only referred to it in whispers. They called it Thornhill. Thornhill Asylum for the morally defective child. From 1865 to 1897, over 400 children were sent there. Most never came back. Officially, it was a Christian rehabilitation home for troubled youth. Unofficially, it became one of the most efficient death machines of the post-Civil War South. What went on inside Thornhill's chapel-turned-laboratory was sealed away for over a century until now, because recently uncovered church records, medical logs, and sealed correspondences paint a picture that is nothing short of horrifying. And what you're about to hear is not just a story about one insane man. It's about a family dynasty, a religious cover, and a profitable industry built on pain. But a warning before we begin this story isn't for everyone. If you came here for comfort, you should click away now. But if you're someone who believes that history's darkest truths deserve to be unearthed, no matter how long they've been buried, then you're in the right place. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from, because the shadows cast by Thornhill stretch farther than you think. Now, let us go back to the year 1865, when the Civil War had just ended, and a grieving, fractured country looked to faith for answers. That's when the Calderon family opened their doors to children who had nowhere else to go. But those doors only opened one way. To understand the horrors of Thornhill, you must first understand who built it. The Calderon family arrived in Kentucky in the spring of 1865, weeks after the Confederate surrender. Led by Reverend Silas Calderon, a former battlefield chaplain turned child reformer, the family brought with them two things: a message of divine order and a plan for institutional salvation. Silas was a tall, hawk-eyed man in his early 50s, with a preacher's voice that could turn fire and brimstone into lullabies. He claimed to have seen visions on the battlefield, visions of a generation of fallen children who could only be redeemed through discipline, obedience, and purification. His wife, Temperance Calderon, was rarely seen in public. Locals described her as fragile, though others whispered she had once been institutionalized herself. Their 4 children were anything but forgettable. Elias Calderon, the eldest son at 29, was a licensed physician who never practiced in any real hospital. Instead, he became Thornhill's in-house medical examiner, collecting anatomical texts and surgical tools with what others described as morbid fascination. He spoke little, but when he did, it was often about cleansing the soul through physical recalibration. Next came Josephine, 26, soft-spoken, radiant, and praised for her musical talents and charity work. But survivors, those few who lived, described her as the most terrifying of all. She played piano hymns during nighttime sessions and told the children that their cries were proof the devil was leaving them. The twins, Nathaniel and Mercy, were 21 when Thornhill opened. Nathaniel ran the daily operations, assigning rooms, directing staff, monitoring new arrivals. Mercy worked in the reflection wing, a name that disguised its true purpose: isolation, starvation, and correctional confinement. And finally, there was Father Silas's brother, Dr. Alban Calderon, a defrocked neurologist from Baltimore with no official license but extensive knowledge of 19th century brain mapping, phrenology, and cognitive obedience therapy. He was responsible for what became known in recovered documents as the Silent Chamber. Now you might be wondering, how did a family like this operate in full view of society for over 3 decades? Simple. They wrapped themselves in religion, patriotism, and philanthropy. Silas was named honorary chaplain of the Kentucky Orphan Relief Fund. Elias donated regularly to medical supply drives. Josephine published devotional poetry in church newsletters. And Thornhill was marketed as a refuge for the misplaced child, a second chance for the morally broken. But once inside, there were no second chances, only records. And those records, sealed until 1972, revealed a pattern so methodical, so cold, that even hardened FBI archivists reportedly left the room in silence. But we'll get to the files soon enough. First, we need to understand how the Calderons built Thornhill itself, because the building wasn't just a hospital, it was a machine. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a building that felt wrong before you even stepped inside? Not haunted, exactly, just designed for a different kind of worship. That's how survivors described Thornhill Chapel. Its gray stone walls were imported from Virginia. Its stained glass windows shimmered with scenes of St. Augustine, St. Paul, and the most prominent, a sword-wielding archangel standing over a weeping child. The chapel could seat 120, but there were rarely more than 10 people in the pews. You see, public worship wasn't Thornhill's purpose. Obedience was. The chapel was built first before the dormitories, the clinic, the kitchens. According to old blueprints, which resurfaced in a state archive in 1994, the building was constructed with a full basement, though it was never mentioned in any official report. A basement with no exterior access, no emergency egress, and most disturbing, 12 small windowless rooms, each outfitted with shackles bolted to stone walls, narrow drainage trenches, and a hidden vent system that could deliver either warm air or something far more sinister. At the far end of the underground level was a single room, labeled Observation Chamber B, connected by a narrow corridor to Dr. Alban Calderon's private laboratory. Sound familiar? It should, because this was no different than what we'd later see in places like Ravensbrück or Tuskegee. Only this happened 3 decades earlier, and to children. Church visitors, well-meaning donors, and clergymen were shown a different version of Thornhill. They saw prayer circles, clean beds, smiling staff, Josephine playing hymns on the chapel piano, Silas reading scripture in a warm voice, but they never saw what was behind the altar, because behind that wooden crucifix and velvet curtain was a trap door cleverly hidden beneath a false dais. Down a stone stairwell, always kept locked, was a space the Calderons referred to as the penumbra, Latin for the edge of shadow. Some of you may be thinking, how could something like this operate for 30 years without someone speaking up? Here's the truth. Someone did. In 1873, a young coal worker named Ellis Rowe claimed he heard cries from beneath the chapel while making a coal delivery. He reported it to the local sheriff. The very next week, Rowe was found drowned in Mill Pond Lake, his mouth filled with gravel. The coroner ruled it a work accident. The case was closed. No one reported anything again for 18 years. The architecture of Thornhill wasn't accidental. It was ritualistic. Every detail, from the way the pews were arranged to the acoustics of the ceiling, was designed not for salvation, but for silence. Because when the chapel doors were closed and the hymns began to play, no one could hear what was happening underneath. And the children, they were taught from day one that the basement wasn't real, that it was just a story to keep them obedient. But the screams were very real. If you want to understand the Calderons, not just what they did, but why they believed it was holy, you have to read their doctrine. Not the Bible they held up in public, but the handwritten book kept locked in a wooden case behind Elias's surgical desk. Its title, The Doctrine of Broken Things. It wasn't published. It wasn't ever meant to be. But thanks to a fire inspector's report recovered in 1978, excerpts of it survive, charred around the edges, but legible. And what it reveals is a theology twisted beyond recognition. The Calderons believed that certain children were born morally fractured, not evil, not criminal, just wrong. They described them as unsouled. Children born of mixed blood illegitimacy, trauma, or mental illness. Children who had no true spiritual architecture and therefore could not respond to ordinary mercy. The only way to save them, Silas wrote, was through suffering calibrated to divine order. Let that sink in. They didn't torture children despite their religion. They tortured children because of it. One passage reads, "The vessel must be shattered before it can be sanctified. The cries of the weak are not pain but purification." Another, "A child's silence is not a sign of trauma, but the beginning of correction. He who screams is still resisting. He who submits becomes clay." They called their process reform through collapse. A carefully staged sequence of isolation, hunger, exposure to cold, followed by structured guidance that often involved restraints, induced hallucination, and direct suggestion. Sound familiar? It should. Modern psychology would call it trauma bonding. Cult leaders call it breaking through, but the Calderons called it grace. By the early 1870s, Thornhill had developed an intake program. Children were sent by train or cart, most from overwhelmed orphanages or families desperate to hide a secret. The forms always used the same euphemism, involuntary placement for moral realignment. Each child was evaluated by Josephine and Elias within 48 hours. If they were docile, they were sent to the communal dorms. If they resisted, lied, stuttered, or flinched, they were marked Category 3 and sent below. If they tried to run, they became non-viables. What happened to non-viables was never recorded, but the logs show they were never reassigned. Now I know what you're thinking. Was there no oversight, no inspections, no teachers or nurses who said something? There were. But those who raised questions found themselves quietly replaced or, in one case, institutionalized themselves. In 1875, a visiting nurse named Margaret Bellamy wrote to the Kentucky Board of Mental Health. She expressed concerns about the children's condition, the locked basement, and the smell she couldn't place. 3 weeks later, she was diagnosed with melancholic hysteria and committed to St. Jude's Sanatorium in Louisville. She died there 8 months later of self-starvation. Her complaint was never investigated. So I'll ask you again, because this question will keep coming back. How many people knew and looked away? How many believed the Calderons when they said, "This is the Lord's work"? Because once you accept the idea that some children are better off broken, anything becomes permissible. And in Thornhill's chapel, everything was. Let's talk numbers, or more precisely, the absence of them. From 1865 to 1897, official records list 223 children admitted to Thornhill Asylum. But when state auditors revisited those files during a quiet review in 1968, they noticed something strange. The facility received enough funding, supplies, and rail vouchers for over 600. That's a discrepancy of nearly 400 children, and it gets worse. When comparing Thornhill's patient logs with train depot manifests from nearby Hazard, Kentucky, it became clear between 1870 and 1889 at least 142 children arrived, but were never logged at all. They were never assigned beds, never issued meal rations, never even received names in the dormitory rolls. They simply vanished. Some investigators believe they may have died of disease. Others suggested clerical error. But then, in 1995, a private researcher named Dr. Helen Marston uncovered something that changed everything. She gained access to a forgotten trunk of correspondence from Reverend Silas Calderon, letters written to orphanage administrators, parish priests, and distant cousins. Inside, she found dozens of handwritten death notices. Each was a variation on the same template. "It is with divine sorrow that we inform you of the child's passing during corrective rites. The body has been sanctified and returned to the earth. We pray your heart finds peace in their restoration. No causes of death, no dates, no burial locations." But each letter was accompanied by a single object: a shoe, a hair ribbon, a page torn from a child's Bible, sometimes a finger bone inside a paper pouch. It was as if the Calderons believed these tokens satisfied the concept of closure. Now think about that. Imagine being the only living relative of a child, receiving no body, no funeral, only a wooden box with a name scrawled in pencil and a blood-stained ribbon tucked inside, and you were expected to accept that. Many did, because to question it meant challenging the word of God as spoken through men like Silas Calderon. And in 19th century Kentucky, that wasn't just blasphemy, it was social suicide. Here's something else. The children most likely to disappear were not just poor. They were black, mixed-race, disabled, or from unwed mothers. Those society already considered disposable. The Calderons didn't need to hide them. Society had already erased them. And maybe that's what makes this story so chilling. Not just the cruelty, but how easily it was allowed to happen. To this day, no cemetery has been confirmed for Thornhill's missing children. No death certificates, no official closure, only anomalies in the soil scans behind the chapel. Over 17 depressions, rectangular, unevenly spaced, each roughly 4 feet long, the kind of pattern that doesn't come from natural erosion. But that's not the worst of it, because buried beneath those graves, forensic geologists found something even more disturbing: wooden beams. Charred. Stacked. A burn chamber. We'll return to that soon. But first, we need to understand how Thornhill became more than just a family-run asylum, because in the late 1870s, the Calderons found partners, and together they built something even darker than the chapel itself. Let's shift perspective for a moment. By now, you might think Thornhill was an isolated horror, a product of one family's twisted theology quietly concealed in the Kentucky hills. But that's not the full story, because in 1878, Reverend Silas Calderon stopped acting alone. He began corresponding with a group based in Louisville, composed of physicians, clergy, industrialists, and even judges, men who believed the post-war South had become morally diseased. They called themselves the Society for Moral Architecture, and their mission was chillingly simple: to restore the Christian order through institutional correction of defective stock. The society wasn't public, it wasn't listed in any official records. But thanks to a series of leaked letters discovered in a retired priest's attic in 1986, we now know they met quarterly at private estates. They pooled resources to fund moral sanctuaries like Thornhill, and they developed shared criteria for who qualified as reformable versus sacrificial. One letter dated 1879 reads, "Children beyond spiritual recall are best returned to the source. Their pain sanctifies our own failings as stewards of virtue." The signature, Dr. Malcolm Hale, a professor of phrenology from Boston, who never once visited Thornhill in person, yet donated over $5,000 in surgical equipment. That's roughly $150,000 today, and it gets darker. The society began to circulate results from Thornhill's interventions, treating the children not as patients but as data points: survival rates, silencing response times, resistance breakdown periods. They even had a coded metric for complete moral erasure. One file simply labeled Case 42C, 9-year-old mulatto female, collapse achieved in 72 hours. Next to it a note, viable for replication. This wasn't theology anymore. It was systematized cruelty justified by doctrine and funded like a business. You may be asking yourself, how is it that no one stopped this simple? Because powerful men believed they were building something holy. They saw themselves as engineers of the soul, restoring a postbellum world they thought had spiraled into moral chaos. And in that world, pain was just a means to order. There's one more detail you need to know. In the winter of 1880, Thornhill's chapel underwent renovations, not for expansion, but to install new listening tunnels and underground access shafts leading to adjacent buildings. One such building, a textile workshop, run by children, where the average workday began at 3 a.m. and ended at dusk, where underperformance resulted in reassignment to Chamber B. where no adult staff was ever documented, except for one. Mercy Calderon. We'll come back to her soon, but before we do, I want to take you inside the records of one specific child, one whose case broke the pattern, one who left behind just enough to be remembered. Her name was Delilah M. She was 8, and she kept a journal hidden inside a broken hymnal. Sometimes it only takes one voice to shatter a wall of silence. That voice belonged to Delilah M., an 8-year-old girl transferred to Thornhill in the autumn of 1881. Her intake file, miraculously preserved in the county orphanage logs, says she was the daughter of a washerwoman and a black Union soldier. Her mother had died in childbirth. Her father was never located. She was described as bright but unruly. The notes claim she refused to pray when asked, and that she laughed when shown scripture. Category 3, sent directly to the reflection wing. But Delilah didn't forget who she was. And in the 2 months she spent inside Thornhill, she managed to do something no one else had. She wrote everything down. In 2004, during a private demolition project on the Thornhill grounds, a historian named Maeve Kennerly recovered an old, mold-softened hymnbook buried beneath a floorboard in the north dormitory. At first glance, it seemed ordinary pages swollen from age, the spine eaten by mildew. But inside, tucked between hymns 141 and 142, were 12 loose pages written in a child's hand. The ink had faded, but the words remained. They weren't full sentences, they weren't dates, but they were enough to piece together a child's daily nightmare. Here are some of Delilah's entries. Today, the soup had something in it. I didn't tell. She made Ruth sing with no tongue. He said the cold makes you clean. I'm tired of clean. There's a room under the church. It eats the loud ones. I counted 4 windows, then none. I wish my name wasn't mine. Think about that. This wasn't a diary. It was a code of survival, a map from one forgotten child to whoever might listen 100 years later. Delilah's final note reads, "If you find this, I'm probably not. But Ruth saw the door open. That means somebody hears. I hope it's God or a woman." And that last line, "I hope it's God or a woman," that stuck with me, because Delilah understood something most adults at Thornhill never did. If salvation ever came to that place, it wasn't going to come in robes or from sermons. It was going to come from truth, from witness, from somebody finally listening. We'll never know exactly what happened to Delilah. There's no record of her discharge, no death certificate, no grave. But 1 week after her last known entry, Thornhill filed a requisition request for a child-sized straight-back chair and a new surgical lamp. The request was approved. So when people ask why we tell these stories, why we dig into the rot behind institutions like Thornhill, I think of her because Delilah didn't need saving. She needed to be remembered, and now she is. In every horror story, there's a figure that doesn't quite fit someone who lingers at the edges of nightmares, half remembered, half invented. At Thornhill, that figure was the woman in white. For years, survivors, what few there were, spoke of her. A pale figure who appeared in the halls after midnight. A nurse who didn't speak but sometimes left water or bandages by the children's cots. Someone who opened doors that were supposed to stay locked. Some said she was a ghost, but she wasn't. Her name was Eleanor Whit, and she was real. Eleanor Whit, born 1850, was the daughter of a physician and a midwife. She was one of the first women in Kentucky to receive unofficial nursing training through underground clinics during the Civil War. Widowed at 24, childless and estranged from her family, for her refusal to remarry, Eleanor applied for a custodial position at Thornhill. In the spring of 1882, just months after Delilah M. vanished. She was hired as a laundress, but what no one knew was that Eleanor had an agenda. You see, she'd grown up hearing whispers about Thornhill. She'd treated children who escaped it, and she didn't believe in reform. She believed in witnessing and in truth. Over the course of 3 years, Eleanor kept her head down. She never confronted the Calderons, never challenged Josephine to her face. But she watched, she listened, and most crucially, she recorded everything. Using hospital linens, she stitched symbols and notes into pillow seams. She hid names and injuries in chalk inside laundry bins. And in her small quarters behind the east furnace, she kept a hidden satchel containing 22 names of unaccounted children, a broken locket belonging to Ruth D., and a small bottle labeled Mercy's Draft Test 4C, Mercy's Draft. That phrase would later appear in grand jury testimony in 1902. The contents of the bottle, an opium tincture sedative laced with mercuric chloride, a substance known to cause hallucinations, organ failure, and silence. Mercy Calderon wasn't just a disciplinarian, she was testing chemical compliance. And Eleanor had proof. But there was one problem. Every time Eleanor got close to exposing something, the target would disappear, the child would be reassigned, or their name would vanish from the logs, or worse, their room would be empty come morning. In late 1885, Eleanor smuggled 2 children out of the laundry wing during a delivery transfer. One died from exposure. The other, a boy named Ansel, made it to a Unitarian mission house in Jackson County. That boy, grown and silent for decades, would later testify in 1921. He described Eleanor as the first person who ever looked at me like I was a person, not a sin. But Thornhill didn't tolerate leaks. Within a month, Eleanor was reported missing, the official story. She wandered into the woods during a snowstorm and never returned. But staff records show her punch card was stamped 2 days after her supposed disappearance, and the last known entry in her hidden satchel, dated December 18, 1885, reads, "If I am taken, may someone remember these names. They are real. They were here. God is not in this place, but I was." They never found her body. But what they did find 112 years later, during a floorboard replacement in the East Wing, was a bundle of blood-stained linens carefully folded containing the name Delilah, stitched in red. So was Eleanor the ghost the children whispered about. No. She was something far more dangerous than a ghost. She was a witness who saw the whole machine and didn't look away. And for that, she vanished. There's one room at Thornhill that doesn't appear on any blueprint, not on the original designs from 1865, not on the revised fire code update from 1874, not even in the handwritten sketches Eleanor Whit left behind. It wasn't marked, it wasn't numbered, but it was sealed not by a door, but by 2 feet of poured concrete smoothed over and painted to match the surrounding brick. Locals called it the Dead Wing, and it sat silent for nearly a century. In 1997, a restoration crew, working under the Kentucky Historical Trust, began clearing the northern hallway for future museum use. The plan was to repurpose Thornhill into a heritage learning center. That plan ended on July 3rd when a demolition worker named Tomas Ramirez struck something hollow behind the wall with his sledgehammer. At first, they thought it was a maintenance closet, but when the concrete was fully removed, what they found wasn't just a room, it was a crypt, roughly 15 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 8 feet high. No windows, no ventilation, just a rusted metal hatch on the ceiling sealed shut with welded iron bars. The walls were covered in deep scratches, some just inches from the floor. Scorch marks lined the baseboards, and in the far left corner beneath a rusted bucket, they found a pile of small shoes, 17 pairs, each tied together with fabric strips. But there was no sign of bodies. Only one thing was found at the center of the floor: a child-sized chair, bolted to the ground, straps still intact. The air samples taken inside the room revealed elevated traces of phenol, chloroform, and mercuric vapor, all toxic, all consistent with early chemical sedation. On the rear wall, investigators found remnants of nail-scratched words, barely visible beneath grime: "Stop, awake, please don't go." And one word repeated: Ruth. Ruth, the same name Delilah M. had written in her notes. The same child Eleanor had tried to protect. The room was never labeled, but internal Thornhill memos, recovered in 2009, mentioned something called Correction Cell 1B. Its use extended moral isolation for resistant subjects. We now believe this chamber was designed to erase personalities, to break down children who couldn't be reformed through hunger, prayer, or sedation. A place where silence was the tool and time was the weapon. You might ask, why seal it? Because in 1893, after a state inquiry was quietly launched into Thornhill's mortality rates, someone at the top realized what was happening inside Cell 1B couldn't be dismissed as discipline. So they buried it, literally, and left no mention of its existence in any public or internal document. But here's the part that haunts me most. In 1997, during the final day of excavation, one worker recorded on tape reported hearing a tapping sound from the far wall. Not loud, not rhythmic, just steady. They paused the dig, checked for animals, found nothing. The sound stopped as soon as the cameras were turned on. But 2 days later, a piece of plaster fell from the opposite wall, revealing a sealed compartment. Inside, a child's drawing, charcoal on linen, 6 stick figures standing in a row. 5 were smiling. The 6th had no face. No one has officially confirmed who that 6th child was, but in the margins of the cloth, in nearly invisible red ink, was one name: Delilah. By the late 1890s, Thornhill was no longer just a place, it was a liability. Too many questions, too many missing children, and too many rumors the Calderons could no longer contain. But the final blow didn't come from a whistleblower. It came from a flood. In the spring of 1897, torrential rains caused the Lickstone River to rise over its banks. Waters poured into the lower levels of Thornhill, bursting pipes and collapsing one of the subterranean corridors. What surfaced wasn't mud. It was bone fragments, fabric scraps, and rusted medical restraints, some still bolted to broken floorboards. Locals found pieces of tiny jawbones, twisted wire mouth gags, even fragments of child-sized crutches, waterlogged and warped. For 3 days, the grounds were closed off, but then they were quietly reopened. No press, no formal investigation, just a fire. A fire that started in the West Wing 2 weeks later and consumed most of the chapel and dormitory records. Official cause: lightning strike. Unofficially, several witnesses reported seeing men carrying crates out of the building at midnight the night before. Crates marked SMA, Society for Moral Architecture. Within 2 months, Reverend Silas Calderon announced his retirement due to spiritual fatigue. Mercy Calderon disappeared from public record. Josephine Calderon was said to have been relocated to a care facility. By fall of that year, Thornhill was shut down under the pretense of budgetary cuts. The land was sold to a coal syndicate, the building left to rot, and for nearly 70 years no one spoke of it again. But the cover-up didn't stop with silence. In 1902, a local school teacher who tried to investigate the ruins was institutionalized for obsessive delusions. In 1924, a journalist named Henry Dunlop published an expose in the Lexington Evening Standard titled "The Orphan House the Devil Built." The paper shut down within the year, and Dunlop disappeared on a trip to Hazard County. His remains were never found. Why such relentless suppression? Because Thornhill wasn't just a scandal, it was a blueprint. What happened there wasn't just tolerated, it was replicated in smaller, quieter ways across the country, in poorhouses, reform schools, asylums. And to expose Thornhill fully would have meant exposing them all. But despite everything they burned, Despite every lie told in the name of God and science and purity, they missed one thing. They missed Delilah's name stitched in red. They missed Eleanor's satchel. They missed the people like you who are still listening, because now, over 100 years later, the truth is surfacing again, and no flood, no fire, no lie can bury it forever. Most of Thornhill's children never made it out, but a few did. They didn't talk much. They didn't write memoirs or give interviews, but late in their lives, when they thought no one would believe them and no one would care, they spoke. And thanks to a young social worker named Alexis Brandt, we still have their voices. In 1976, Alexis was compiling oral histories from Appalachian elders for the University of Kentucky. She wasn't looking for Thornhill, but one afternoon in a nursing home outside Berea, she interviewed a 90-year-old woman named Marion H. When asked about her childhood, Marion fell silent. Then she said, "There was a place with no windows and a lady who never blinked." Alexis pressed gently. Marion eventually gave her something more, a song, a slow, droning lullaby sung without rhythm, in a cracked voice. Be still, or the angel will cry. Don't speak, or the silence will die. No mother, no father, no morning, no light. Just God in the hallway turning out the night. The words matched a verse found scratched into the walls of Chamber B. That was the beginning. Over the next 18 months, Alexis found 4 other elders who referenced a place called the Hill or the Gray House. They all had identical scars on their wrists, light sensitivity and near total memory loss before age 10, but when shown a photo of Thornhill's chapel, they cried. Every time. One of them, Benny K., said he remembered being locked in a cold box with red lights. He drew pictures of an iron chair with belts. He remembered a girl named Lila who sang to him through a wall. Another sister, Thomasina, who had joined a convent later in life, whispered, "We weren't those children. We were practice." These survivors were never given reparations. They were never listed in official Thornhill records, but their memories align detail by detail with recovered documents, chemical inventories, and architectural scans. They are proof, living, breathing proof that what happened at Thornhill was real, and that no amount of time, no amount of concrete can erase what a body remembers. Alexis Brandt compiled all her interviews into a private archive. She tried to publish. No press outlet would touch it, but she left behind a quote in her field journal that haunts me to this day. They didn't just silence children. They taught them to forget. But memory is a kind of ghost, too, and ghosts don't stay quiet forever. So if you ever hear someone humming that strange lullaby, if you meet an elder who flinches at church bells, or if you see a scar that looks too small for an accident, listen, because there are still survivors among us, and they remember more than we ever allowed them to say. For over a century, Eleanor Whit's fate remained a mystery. We had her satchel, we had the whispers, we had the stains and scraps and names she tried to preserve. But we didn't have her voice. Until 2022, during a structural stabilization project at the crumbling remains of Thornhill's East Wing, workers discovered a hollow space behind a false support column. Inside was a rusted metal box. In it, a broken pen, a locket containing 2 children's teeth, and a bundle of pages scorched along the edges, written in a tight, shaking hand. It was Eleanor's final journal, dated between October and December of 1885, the last 3 months of her life. What she wrote was not just documentation. It was confession, not of guilt, but of helplessness and clarity. Here are excerpts from those final pages. Oct. 19, 1885. Ruth has stopped speaking, not from silence, but from absence. I touch her shoulder and she blinks, like I'm not real. They call it mercy. I call it subtraction. Nov. 2, 1885. I saw Josephine kneel beside Delilah's cot and whisper, "It's almost over." I do not believe she meant the night. Nov. 27, 1885. They tested a new serum yesterday. One child vomited black and didn't stop. I washed it away with my hands. I don't know her name. I don't know my own anymore. Deck 3, 1885. I tried to leave. The gates were unlocked, but something in me said, if I leave, they win. I turned back. And then the final page. Deck 18, 1885. If anyone finds this, please believe what the children say. They have no power, no voice, no weight in the world, but they carry the truth on their skin and in their eyes. They are not defective, they are not broken. They were made into silence piece by piece, and silence is the easiest lie to believe. Do not believe it. My name was Eleanor Whit. I was here. They were here. Please remember us. That journal now rests in a temperature-controlled vault at the Kentucky State Archive. It is not on public display. You must file a request to view it. You'll be asked not to photograph it, but it is real, and so was she. Thornhill is gone. The structure collapsed during a storm in 2023. Most of what remained was buried under earth and legal indifference. But stories are harder to bury, especially the ones whispered behind closed doors, scratched into wood, stitched into cloth, and passed down in lullabies nobody wants to remember singing. So now that you've heard this story, what will you do with it? Will you shut the tab and move on, or will you tell someone, repeat a name, Delilah, Eleanor, Ruth, Ansel, Marion, Lila, because sometimes the only justice left is memory, and now you carry it.